All right, we'll get going. While I'm getting people settled down, I'm going to ask a question with a bit of a sugar fix reward. I was recently in the States and stayed with a friend of mine up in Oregon in the Willamette Valley. And he's a professor of geology, and he told me they've got the deepest soils in the world. Being a professor of geology, I believed him. And he's right, I've researched it. And he's got a blueberry and apple production on the farm, and I dug that patch on the left to plant an apple tree. And he said, get some tools. I went to grab a crowbar, and he said, you won't need that. And he was right. When I dug it, it was covered in earthworms. By the time I went and got my camera and came back, they'd disappeared. So it shows you how active the soil is. I could have gone down 6 feet in 10 minutes. So he said they've got some of the deepest, if not deepest, fields in the world, and I've got a sugar reward here. I've got wrapped on the knuckles yesterday because it wasn't organic. But we're all allowed an excess. Anyone want to... I'll give you 3 guesses as to who gets close to the right answer. Anyone want to make a first bid? How deep? Yeah.
About 10 metres.
About 10 metres? Because you've broken the ice, I'll give you a reward. So well, that's a good start. Any other bids?
20 metres.
20 metres?
Thank you.
Well done. I'll take any further final bid. Anyone want to have a go? Yeah. 18. All good guesses. The answer will surprise you.
Oh my God!
10,000 feet.
That's not true.
It's true. So what happened was, towards the end of the Ice Age, as that big ice sheet started to melt, these dams started to build up of meltwater. Eventually got so great the dams would burst, and you'd get the water flow down across the Rockies of 3 times the volume of the Amazon, travelling at over 130 k's, they estimate. And this kept happening. And so hence that extraordinary soil depth. Not quite as good as Gippsland, but not bad. Anyway, well done on that. I certainly got a shock. How do we now turn around some of these big issues? I've recently got to know this guy, Paul Hawken, who for the last 3 decades lives in California, being one of the leading thinkers in the social environmental area. You might have heard of books like Blessed Unrest, The Ecology of Commerce, those sorts of things. And about 15 years ago, he got sick of asking the climate scientists, okay, we've got a problem, what do we do about it? And they all said, well, I don't know, that's not my field. I'm just crunching the numbers on what's going on. So he got 70 experts and scientists to start looking. And as a result, they published this book looking at the 100 best methods to address the carbon problem, the climate change problem, either pulling CO2 down or stopping it going up. They fully costed 80 of them. I've got to know Paul, remarkable guy, and I said to him, when I looked at the book, in the top 20 or 30, there's 8 of those methods, 7 or 8 of those methods are actually variants of regenerative agriculture. Grazing, silvopastoral systems, biological cropping, etc. And I said, let's call them all regenerative ag. What are the numbers telling us? Well, numbers are telling us that by nearly 2.5 times the next best method, regenerative ag is #1 by a country mile in addressing the climate issue. We can pull down more carbon than any other approach, which I find incredibly exciting. But politically, etc., it's still not supported or recognised. And so going back to those boundaries, we've got the solutions by putting more carbon in the soil to most of those other major issues that we're continuing to destabilise in the Earth's systems. I'm not saying we can return all the biodiversity, we can certainly increase it on the grasslands and the agroforestry and stuff that we're working in. This is the other biggie. From our malpractice in agriculture is coming a lot of the modern human ill health issues. And I'm not going to get into what the big food processors are doing by stripping out nutrients so we can store white goods on shelves for years, all that sort of stuff, or the junk food operators, that's another separate issue. But many of the industrial foods coming off landscapes are pretty well bereft of nutrients because of what we're doing to the soil biology. And so when I showed you the great acceleration, all those upward curves, socially and environmentally, the human ill health epidemic, mental and physical, autisms ADHDs and cancers and obesity. It's all linked, all in parallel, all connected. So the worst aspects of industrial agriculture destroys food nutrient availability, diversity and quality. And we now know the poisons from these processes are getting into the industrial foods, which I'm going to touch on. So you kill off the soil biology, as I've explained before, that vast variety of nutrients that we are evolved for, micronutrients, minerals, isn't getting into our food. And there's a lot of evidence now to show that. So our species, the modern hominids, evolved in the African savannas for about 1 million years. Indigenous hunter-gatherers go off collecting food plants. Most Indigenous women can identify at least 500 medicinal and food plants. Men go off hunting, not just hunting meat. Those animals have been browsing shrubs. And I know from working with people like Fred Provenza, professor at Utah State Uni, who's just retired, that in the shrubs, there are tens of thousands of what are called phytochemicals, secondary chemicals through photosynthesis, your tannins and your phenols and all those sorts of things. Used sensibly, we plant Australian wattles in a grazing system, for example, the tannins will kill intestinal worms if you get the right species. There's a whole lot of, we think horizontally, or I did, but if you start thinking vertically with mixed grazelands, you can start putting in other interesting things. But our species evolved there, so we are hardwired with detectors in our alimentary system, our organs, our gut, feeding to the brain to detect shortages. And anyone who's watched their wife get a craving in the 3rd month of pregnancy, it's not an excuse to have oysters or something, it's a genuine detection in that system saying, I'm short of a key nutrient, I need it urgently for this rapidly growing baby, for example. So we still have that inherent co-evolved feedback system. And that could be another view of where our species is evolving, and it wasn't so sad, it's quite funny. You could guess the multinational brand name you could put on the milkshake container. But the evidence is alarming, and there's scores of papers now supporting it. This is research back in 2008, 63 wheat cultivars, mainly the soft whites, the bread wheats. So what they've done with the modern wheat plant, they've made them dwarf wheats, focused on maximum production and responsiveness to fertilisers, etc. They've lost a lot of the natural adaptability to droughts, hustling for nutrients, all that sort of stuff. Nutrients have crashed. Copper, iron, magnesium, manganese, phosphorus, selenium, zinc, etc. Stuff that's integral to our immune function and our physiological cell function, etc. And this is repeated across the scale, lots of publications. Horticulture, fruit, etc. Vegetables, same story. Grown on soil, irrigated and fertilised with high inputs, increases growth at the expense of phytochemical, nutrient, etc. richness. There's a cost when we start interfering with long co-evolved systems. Even establishment bodies like the UK Ministry of Agriculture, drastic crashes in vegetables, copper, calcium, iron and so on. Same in meat, off industrial landscapes and dairy, horticulture, coming out of the UK ministry, and this is repeated widely. So there's a cost, and that's relating now to obesity, immune diseases, etc., etc. You cannot do with those fundamental chemicals we're co-evolved for. So most of the decline's related to a serious decline in soil health and soil carbon, for the reasons I've been saying. That soil biology, mycorrhizal fungi, etc., are working to put in all those nutrients. So poor quality food's largely caused by poor quality soil, largely. There are other factors. But this is the other really alarming issue, and that's Roundup glyphosate, we now know, not just getting into our industrial foods, but it's having really major impact on a lot of the modern health issues. And there's a lot more evidence coming, and I just want to walk you through that. So it's really the elephant in the room, because a lot of our modern agriculture is predicated on it. But there are some solutions, so we don't go home and slash our wrists if we're farming, because we can now farm, and in a better way and more productively than without this. So it's now the most widely used chemical in the world, herbicide, about 1 million tonnes going out. It's not necessarily the worst chemical, and it could be banned because of the court cases that I'll touch on briefly. Its replacements are even worse, variants of 2,4-D esters and all that sort of stuff. So if we think there's industrial solutions to this problem, there ain't, they're going to be worse. Just an example of what's happening in the States, that green area are the farms in the Mississippi catchment zone. The water coming out of that zone into the Gulf of Mexico is causing this enormous dead zone. There's no oxygen in that water because of the chemicals and the fertiliser. And you wouldn't drink it because it hasn't just got all that in it, it's got things like birth control chemicals in it, heart chemicals coming out of the effluent, etc. You know, it doesn't matter how you refine it, you wouldn't go near it. That's what it looks like, hundreds of kilometres out of the Gulf. There's no fishing industry in that area. And this is why you wouldn't drink the water. It looks like that coming out near the mouth, just putrid. That's some early example of where cancer is occurring in the States. The recent example shows its concentration down the lower end of the Mississippi. Highest cancer rates in the developed world, correlated with some of this stuff coming out of the farming landscapes, I would suggest, and so are the people looking at it. And so we've now got first world epidemics. In the States now, 1 child in 36 has autism by a 3-year-old. In the 70s, it was 1 in 550 odd. Attention deficit disorder, asthma. They're now projecting that, looking at the trends, which are exponential, like all those other great takeoffs. Obesity, by the time adults in the States get to 70, in about 25 years, you can have obesity 1 in 3, major depression 1 in 2. Every second person's got cancer, 1 in 2, sorry. Dementia, etc. And they're saying that by 2035, 1 child in 3, you follow the projections, is going to have autism. Now, just autism and obesity alone in a developed economy is going to kill that entire economy. The cost to that society of medical health, etc. So this is alarming stuff. So glyphosate's function, discovered in the 60s by Swiss chemists, is as a chemical chelator, which means this guy discovered that it was a wonderful chemical when he discovered it to strip out rust, etc., in the inside of galvanised pipes. So you put it onto a plant, it grabs all the minerals, etc., and takes them out of solution or whatever, and the plant dies. That's why it goes yellow. So imagine when that gets into our guts, what it's going to do to the critical microbiology world in there. And there's been some scientists that have been ringing the bell for a long while. Bob Kramer has been speaking out. He used to be with the Department of Agriculture in the States, hasn't got a job there anymore for obvious reasons. Don Huber, who has spoken down here, I know, well into his 80s now, a wonderful scientist, respected on both sides of the equation in the States, a really senior, caring, gentle soil scientist. He's been ringing the bell since the late 70s about glyphosate. And summarising some of their work, kills beneficial soil microbes. I'm talking about glyphosate that keep the disease-causing elements in check, binds all the nutrients. We've been there. Plants are now vulnerable to disease without the defence because of that chelation, etc. Its breakdown products are more toxic. And the list goes on and on. Evidence showing that it's going to kill earthworms up to 50%, depending on how you use it, etc. This is a soybean crop, which they usually spray with a fungicide called the sudden death syndrome. They ran out of glyphosate in this paddock, this corner here. And what happened was that the protective elements in the soil had been killed by the spraying, but that sort of balanced complex system preserved the deaths occurring on this corner. So if you think about what I was saying about mycorrhizal fungi and the use of fungicides in modern farming, you can see why it's so devastating. Some of Huber's other concerns, obvious nutrient deficiency, high levels of toxic products, mycotoxins, that's for fungus, premature ageing, reproductive failure. Some of the research results he shows and was involved in with animal abortions and deformities when it's sprayed on plants when you graze it are pretty horrific. And I don't want you to all go home slashing your wrists, so I won't go on too much. It has genetic impacts as well, which I'll touch on briefly. These researchers, Stephanie Samsel used to work with the Department of Ag. She doesn't work there anymore for obvious reasons. And if they did a review of over 280 papers in the biomedical field, across the whole spectrum, all sorts of diseases, physiological function. And they saw a commonality, which was glyphosate, where the research was relevant to that area. And they're saying it's probably the most important factor in the development of multiple chronic diseases and conditions prevalent in westernised societies. And they list them, and they're nearly all the big ones are there. They're not saying it's the sole cause, but they're saying it's a major factor. And there's two key reasons that are emerging why this might be the case. It interferes in this protein formation pathway I'll touch on in a minute, the Shikimati pathway. and it's water soluble. That means it penetrates key defence barriers like gut linings and brain linings. And there's even organic farmers tens of kilometres off Mississippi who are now losing their accredited status because they're finding glyphosate in some of the water in the plants, because being water soluble, it's being evaporated up from the river and dropped over in rain. So water solubility is not a great thing when you've got a bad poison like this. Therefore, is it in our food and water? Yes, you bet. A lot of the testing now shows it's lacing a lot of our industrial foods. And if you think about the glyphosate used on the GM plants, the big three, corn, soy, cereals, etc., and penetration of corn syrup through a lot of the foods of Western world, it's a frightening implication. And this is why it's causing trouble. It's second brain of ours, weighs nearly the same as our head brain, this extraordinary zoo in our guts of billions of creatures that really drive our whole immune system. We don't know what some of them look like, but we know they're absolutely integral to our function. And so the Shikimate pathway is that when it's the making of key amino acids and hormones and proteins, and glyphosate is chopping it off right near the end. So a lot of the key chemicals involved for immune function and cell function aren't being made, rendering us more defenceless. And when Monsanto was challenged, they said, no, humans don't have the Shikimate pathway, and they're right. They forgot to tell us that the bugs in our gut do have this pathway, and they're the integral guys to our immune function. So the ecosystem use bacterial population patterns in our guts predict the occurrence of a lot of these major diseases. We're changing the ecology of our guts through this sort of stuff. And getting stuff like leaky gut. In a healthy diet in human, you've got gatekeepers that stop the bad stuff getting through to your bloodstream, which can then go around the body. Some of those defences are being lowered and allowing things like glyphosate in different formulations to get through. Same's happening in the vital blood-brain barrier. And you start to think about the autisms and the ADHs and stuff, and you're wondering what's going on there. There's evidence emerging that the really delicate membranes, like placental and embryonic membranes, it might be crossing there. That starts to raise issues about genetic mutations, all that sort of stuff. And this guy is at the forefront. I spent time with him recently. We were talking at a conference, and he's probably one of the leading guys in this field now. He was a doctor that specialised in autism for 20 years. And then he met some regenerative farmers and started to discovered that the same healthy microbes involved in the soil were common in the gut. And he started to realise, gee, if there's problems happening in the soil with what we're doing, and that's getting into our food. And so he's now got 7 or 8 PhDs and senior researchers looking at this field, and that's him and other scientists is where some of this knowledge is now coming from. He's got an unbelievable brain, and we're lucky to have him now partnering with us in Regen Ag. And I'm not going to waste time on this. We now have 3 major court rulings around the world against Monsanto, or Bayer now. 2 in America and 1 in France. One of the court rulings was over 200 million damages. You'd hope that the lawyers in Bayer have done their due diligence. There's something like 15,000 claimants lined up for the courts already. I would suggest at some stage it'll be banned. It was pretty close in Germany to tip the vote for the European community, except the Bayer merger was on at the time, and that may have saved it. One of the side issues that I've touched on earlier is this new form of genetic inheritance. Not new, we just know more about it suddenly. So traditionally, once Watson and Crick in the 50s unravelled the helical structure of the DNA, where our genes' whole inheritance lies, it was thought that the only way that could change is through mutations, a very long process through serendipity, if you like. We now know there's another mechanism. Doesn't change the actual DNA. It's environmental factors switching the genes on or off. And that's called epigenetics. And it's far more responsive, far more immediate, can happen in the first year, and it can be inherited, this epigenetic functions. And the reason researchers started to get onto it was when that period in Holland, when the Nazis deliberately starved a lot of the population in that period from late 44 to April 45, any mothers that were pregnant at that time, we now know had serious consequences. And so when the progeny who were in utero at that time were studied when they were, I think it was about 17 or 18, the researchers didn't know anything about epigenetics. They were just wondering whether there'd been physical impacts. What they found was quite startling. 2- and 3-fold increases in the starved babies with schizophrenia and some of the mental issues as well as some physical ones. And the only solution they could come up with was it had to be something like this new process of epigenetics, and that's really what's led to a lot of the research. So we stress genetics as the mechanism of evolution, yes, but we don't appreciate that our genes are constantly talking and interacting with our environment, which can switch on or off some of the genetic expression. And this great Lawson cartoonist here, these animals do it by instinct, dare to be nocturnal, become one of the herd, how to avoid natural selection, etc. We've got to keep laughing in the face of some of this evidence. The really mind-blowing thing that's emerging is that for a long while, when the geneticists looked at the genome in cells, etc., there's a lot of stuff they couldn't explain. They called it junk DNA. They said, oh, it's just part of the old history of evolution and it's now just sidelined, hanging around. We now know it's actually not junk. A lot of that is the messenger chemicals, the messenger RNA, microRNA, which play a key role in switching on and off genes. And these things float around in the air from plants, they float around in our gut. And this is the mind-boggling thing. We are absorbing that and it's incorporated into our own genome. So if you start to think about we are part of our environment, this is the next step. We are an indivisible part of the environment. You go for a walk in these good Gippsland forests or out in the grassland, those plants, through their stomata, as they breathe, are releasing microparticles of RNA. We breathe them in, we incorporate them, we become part of our environment, even if it's small segments. So there's yet one more reason why we don't separate ourselves in a mechanical mind fashion from our environment. We are intimately part of it. So these guys determine which genes are on and off, which goes back to the environmental influences on us. So I'm starting to talk about things, something like glyphosate here. It's going to switch on and off in our gut a lot of the stuff we don't want turned on or turned off. 15% of the RNA that's circulating in our bloodstream comes from the bacteria in our gut. So yeah, we're part of the bacterial genome, which is impacting us. You talk about the whole thing. Here's this squirrel telling his psychiatrist, when I learned you are what you eat, I realised I was nuts. And we've all heard this saying about you are what you eat. What epigenetics is now telling us, we're also what our mothers and grandmothers ate. So any mums out there, and we don't even know much about the sperm transmission in males, but it's got to be there. We've got to be very careful. If you're eating that stuff, it has a major negative impact. And if we're eating that, we're not eating the good stuff. So, huge implications. And so this cross-species communication is mind-blowing. MicroRNA travels far and can function across species, including us. So 15%, as I said, of the microRNAs we get from our bacteria in our gut or from the air. 15% in our blood, and therefore in us it's coming from fungi in our guts and in the air. And 5% is coming from the food we eat. So if you're eating GM soy chock full of glyphosate chemicals, ain't going to do you a lot of good. And in the scheme of things, where we're getting our DNA from, our microRNA from, we're pretty insignificant. We're one species with about 20,000 genes. Bacteria's got 40,000 species, 2 million genes. Parasites in our gut, etc., 300,000 species, 2 billion genes. Fungi, there's over 5 million species, 125 trillion genes. Viruses, you can't count how many genes, more than stars in the universe. And we're imbibing elements of those things. And they're weirdo stuff, viruses and fungi and some of these nano sort of particles that kick around. So we're resetting the genome of the planet. We've just destroyed 50% of the biodiversity of the planet. We're clearing Indonesian rainforests, Amazon. New South Wales recently released clearing laws, including close to rivers. Clearing in New South Wales went up 800% in 1 year. Queensland's doing it. And so we keep doing that. It eventually will impact us, because that's our gene pool. We must treat it with huge respect, because if we kill it, we're going to kill ourselves. So it's our choice. Regenerative agriculture can help save the planet and ourselves. We breathe in healthy RNA, or put healthy food in our gut, or we can roll the loaded dice with these sort of practices. So addressing human ill health, very simple answer. One of the best things we can do is develop healthy soil biology. Get the right nutrients, micronutrients into our guts, huge impact. Go for a walk in healthy forests instead of cooping up in air-conditioned rooms. There's lots of things we can do. And that's the guts of it, healthy soil. And so I'm preaching revolution. Through healthy food and fibre, off regenerated landscapes and partnering with urban communities for both food demand, but what they're doing, we can change the world. And having written a book on the political destruction of the wool industry, Australia's hidden $20 billion disaster, I'm pretty sceptical solutions are going to come from the top. It's up to us, farmers and food growers, to change. And so there's great things happening. The Minister of Agriculture in Western Australia is full on for Regen Ag. They now have a whole regional food economy. You've got local other methods, you've got farmers markets, and there's a lot of stuff starting to happen. And these guys are a big part of it, the mycorrhizal fungi. Just touch on one other issue. What we're doing now with our kids, instead of getting them more out into the forests and the paddocks, they're getting more and more trapped by electronics, let alone the effects on their plastic brains. It's affecting development. This is for 7th and 8th graders in the States, in California, this research. That's the rise from 2009 to 15 in spending time on screens, that solid line. That one there is the drop in activities away from screens. So kids playing in the backyard, etc., crashing while they're spending time on screens. That's the rise of depressive symptoms, and some of the suicide rates in teenagers goes with it. Recent research in Australia by a group called Planet Ark, 6,000 kids, 6 year and under. Only 1 in 4 has ever climbed a tree or a rock. Think about that, those of us that have grown up in farms. 10-year-olds and under, for every hour of outdoor play, is now 7 or 8 hours in front of a screen. And these are the generation that we have to get starting to save the earth. Some alarming stuff going on. So we've got to get that happening, kids reconnecting with nature. And wondering about the marvel of nature. And the cities are starting to move too, which is great. Not just farmers markets, but food gardens and green belts and the whole thing, and that's going to have to be part of the solution. So I'll just wrap up there with a few points, because this is a hell of a good news. I don't want you to go away with this last segment and get all depressed about it. I'm really upbeat about what we landscape managers can do, partnering with the city. Yeah, that's dramatic, but I firmly believe, given the evidence on the Anthropocene and human health, as a species we're on the edge, but it's not beyond being swept over the brink. And as this leading environmentalist said, Gus Beth, today's problems can't be solved with today's mind. As an old farming Fred said to me the other day, the thinking that got us in the shit won't get us out of it. We've got to change our mindscapes if we're going to change this sort of stuff that I wasn't able to read. We could get depressed about the situation and join Monty Python down the pub. So remember, when you're feeling very small and insecure, how amazingly unlikely is your birth, and pray that there's intelligent life somewhere in space, because there's bugger all down here on Earth. No, I'm not going to subscribe. Good song to sing. We can do better than that. Donald Worcester is a wonderful environmental historian in the States, and he's left, I think, a pretty good credo for farming and gardening, making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life, which I've just spent a fair bit of time talking about. And as Lunig often captures it, I'm not saying we ditch the mechanical mind, that'd be crazy. I mean, the best of science and that sort of thinking, it's quite wonderful. But we can't let it dominate. We have to marry with the organic approach. We have to treasure Mother Earth while using the best of human cerebral capacity. And so I'd put before you what's in front of us, the law of the turtle. Behold, the turtle makes progress only when he sticks his neck out. We've got to go for it now. So I'll conclude. This is why I'm so upbeat about regenerative agriculture. We do have key solutions to the Anthropocene crisis. We do have an agriculture that heals natural systems. And we have the solutions, many of the solutions to the human health crisis. It's a pretty good trifecta for any occupation. And I'll leave you with this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a wonderful moral thinker. Hitler had him deliberately executed second last day of the war because of his strength. And he left us with this thought: the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. And that epigenetic and all the other issues that I've addressed really touches on that. So I'll leave it there, and so thank you.